through their service-led provisions and advocacy and through their engaging campaigns. And notwithstanding, I recently joined their board of trustees. Now, I'd like to talk to you today about male rape victimisation, policing, diversity and policy. But I want to provide a little bit of background, just to give you a bit of context, about how I got involved.
Just like
Right. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
yeah.
Right, okay. I forgot my pocket somewhere. Okay. I don't normally use a mic, so, okay. So basically, as I said, I want to give a bit of background as to how I got started researching this area, okay? So it dates all the way back, cast your minds back to the mid-1990s, a long time ago. And I was studying an MA in criminology at Kingston University in Staffordshire. And I was studying a module on victimology. And one of our workshops was on male victims. But we were asked to debate the research question, can men be victims? Right? Now, I'm sure everyone in this room, it's an easy answer, right? Why were we even asking that question? And I was asked, I was on the, yes, of course men can be victims. Okay? And from that moment onwards, I was like, okay, why as criminologists were we not paying the same level of attention to male victims of sexual harm as female victims of sexual harm? And that's not to trivialize the female experience at all. So I decided, okay, I want to do a dissertation on it. And my supervisor was Professor Sandra Walkley. Some of you may or may not be familiar with her. And she was like, okay, we can try and gain access to some primary data, which we thought we'd sorted. But at the 11th hour, access was denied. And I ended up having to do more of a qualitative literature-based review of the available literature at the time, looking at masculinity theories and psychoanalytic theories as to why and how men can be victims. Then I went on and did an MSc in investigative psychology, and which was, of course, managed by Professor David Cantor. My supervisor for the dissertation then, because I hadn't given up, I still wanted to do some primary research, was Dr. Samantha Hyde. She had collected some data with other colleagues from other academic institutions and said, okay, yes, you can analyze this data. So I thought, great. Again, at the last minute, access was denied. So I ended up doing, analyzing some secondary data. But this was on American data, the National Crime Victimization Survey. And what I did is I wanted to conduct a comparative behavioral analysis of crime scene actions. So I analyzed 1,220 cases of rape, stranger rapes, but I had to whittle it down to a matched sample of 12 males and 24 females, so that I could analyze this using statistical analyses called multiple scalegram analysis, etc. I'm not going to go into the details of all that. I'm just going to give you the findings. So, just to give you a bit of background on that data. So, the survivors were aged 13 to 39, okay, for both males and females. With the female rape survivor cases, they tended to be lone offenders. With regard to the males, they tended to be group offenders. And what I found was interesting, but won't be a surprise to anyone in this room, was both of these samples, when looking at the crime scene actions, obviously key elements were power and control. No surprise there. But what I found was interesting, and bearing in mind obviously they are small samples, was that it was how violence was used. So with the females, looking at the crime scene actions, there was a sustained level of violence throughout the encounter, right? So possibly in response to females' victim-resistance strategies. Then you look at the male rape survivors, and you look at their crime scene actions, okay? And in that one, instead of it being a sustained attack, and somewhat people would say, okay, there's a lower level of violence. Why? Because all of that violence was directed at the beginning. A blitz attack, excessive violence, to debilitate the victim, because they were expecting more of a victim resistance, not necessarily, as we now know, for the victims to make the decision to freeze and submit, a conscious decision to do so, which I know also can have problematic impact as well when engaging with services and getting counselling. So that was that study. Then moving swiftly on, I undertook a PhD in psychology at the University of Leicester, where I was based in the forensic psychology section. My supervisor was Professor Ray Bull and Dr. Ray Sheridan. And I conducted 3 studies, and it's one of these 3 studies, so I took that from like 2003 to 2009. And I'm then going to contextualize that study with recent policy reports and show you, rather depressingly, how things haven't really changed that much. So, the 3 studies I undertook was number 1, the specialist policing response to male rape survivors or victims, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. But I also looked at print media representation of male rape, and also a 3rd study on the prevalence of client-perpetrated sexual violence against male sex workers in London. So again, a very under-researched group. So, I'll give you a bit of background on the sample, first off. So, as I said, historical perspective, the 2000s. I wanted to evaluate, rather ambitiously, the London Metropolitan Police Service and their response to male rape. So I did a bit of background research first. I was lucky enough to get some internal documents and reports, which charted the development of the specialist officer who I'm going to be focusing on today, in the form of the Sexual Offences Investigative Technique Officers, SOAT officers. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, that label, with STOs, specially trained officers. And I know across the country, the titles may differ. They could be RTOs, rape trained officers, SOLOs, sexual offences liaison officers. I could go on. And that's one of the problems as well that's been flagged up in more recent reports, that lack of standardization. So, a little bit about the chaperone scheme, which is the precursor. There were gender stereotypes coming into play, because who were the people that were being encouraged to take up those roles as chaperone officers, female police officers? Why? Because they were considered that they'd be more sensitive, more empathic, etc. And there were kind of some parallels when that was superseded with SOAT officers as well, right? So just bearing all that in mind, trying to gain access to the Met, I didn't have any contacts. It took me 2 years to gain access. Why? Because if anyone works with the police in here, which some of you have, I'd get approval. I'd get a result through cold contact, and the DCI, Detective Chief Inspector, would then get transferred, so I'd have to start all over again. But my aim was that in some of the documentation that I had gained access to, given in the mission statement for Project Sapphire, we now know those officers, Sapphire officers, and Sapphire units. Basically, on their mission statement, one of the things was to improve the response to male rape survivors, which is why I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. You need to let me do it. And I managed to gain that access. So I distributed surveys by email to 300 SOAD officers. How many did I get back? 19. Okay? And I won't even go into all the ethics issues that I had to go through to get that response rate. But, so 19 officers. They were aged between 30 and 53 years. 13 female, 6 male. Ethnicity, no surprise here, 95% Caucasian and white. So, 5% Asian. Now, with regard to some of the findings, from the SOAD officers, a consistent theme that kept coming up was their lack of experience in dealing with male rape cases. And here's a quote from one of the officers. Most assume that hetero male victims can't be raped, and that it mostly happens to gay males, and that it's really welcome, exclamation mark. I think attitudes are changing, but if you have no experience of something, aren't you a little restricted in your ability to deal with it? Okay? So, they're saying they needed more experience with regard to the training, etc. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. And you can see misconceptions of rape coming in there. Also, another point that they raised was the discontinuance of cases and the frustration from that. So there was some disillusionment among SOAD officers with the judicial system, in that they reported that many cases which were considered appropriate, okay, to progress to the trial stage failed to reach it. So they put in all that hard work supporting the survivors, because again, the SOAD role is kind of victim liaison between the victim and the IO, the investigating officer, okay? And they also had to develop exit strategies, because often survivors got quite attached to the SOADs as well. So that could be a problem sometimes. So basically, they'd make a pretty strong, robust case, and then the CPS would say no, right? This point comes up in joint inspection reports from 2021, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. If we look at male and female rape survivors, the sample was aged 17 to 72. Again, 92% white, 70% heterosexual, and they were self-described, the remainder of the sample was self-described as bisexual, lesbian, confused. With male survivors, they were aged 19 to 41, 95% white, 40% heterosexual, and 45% homosexual. What I thought was interesting, and again I'm just picking out select findings here, was the reporting motivations for survivors and how they differed. Okay? For the female rape survivors, they felt a sense of moral obligation. They didn't want it to happen to anybody else. They wanted justice. They were also encouraged to report by family and friends. Okay? And there was 120 survivors that I surveyed to get that data. With regard to males, the sample was much smaller, it was 34. But their motivations to report, because there was a lot of anger there, again, that's not going to be a surprise to most people in the room, they wanted retribution. That was one of the motivating factors. And crucially, again, thinking about the temporal context, the time period when I was collecting this data, it was about access to resources. They didn't know where to get help. So they thought by reporting it, the police could direct them to the appropriate resources, okay, for support. Unfortunately, that didn't always happen, and that's a continuing theme as well in more recent reports that I'm going to talk about later. so supporting my findings. If I move on to poor police communication, this was another theme that cropped up. And this is why I thought it was interesting to survey police officers alongside survivors, because it was fascinating that the same question being put to the police and survivors had very different answers. Okay? So, with regard to updates, survivors were like, we want regular updates about what's going on with our case, even if there's no progress. With the police, they were going, well, we don't want to re-traumatize them, and we don't have any further info, and we don't want to kind of get their hopes up by reading them and then going, well, we've got no further information. So quite different responses there. Again, these are areas that have been picked up in more recent reports. So it's still not happening, this kind of more getting, again, with these reports, that they should be more victim-centered and suspect-focused. They're the buzzwords for a lot of the reports you'll see, like from Operation Soteria, etc., which, as I say, I'll talk about in a moment. What one male rape survivor, this is a direct quote, said was again about the lack of understanding of victim trauma and its impact as to why survivors delayed reporting. One survivor was discouraged from continuing with their case, withdrew from society completely, became reclusive, hermit-like, shame led to isolation, self-blame led to anger, and anger led to depression, depression led to me attempting to take my life, and multiple suicide attempts. Okay? So this is the impact that inappropriate police responses can have, okay? Another unprofessional policing response was that male survivors also reported being shouted at, assumptions being made about their sexual orientation, assertions about their occupation. Did they work as a rent boy? Also, gender stereotypes and narratives, okay? It was taken for granted that survivors would want a female liaison officer, or female SOIT. The implication that they would be more caring and sensitive to the survivor, okay? Here's a quote, and this was in shouty capitals from the survivor, showing how annoyed and frustrated they were. They had, yes, inappropriate remarks and assumptions, crass and insensitive. I was assigned a female liaison officer from CID because it was implied they were more sensitive and appropriate. This was not the case. Given a choice, I would choose women. Not all women are the same. In another case reported by a male survivor, that the female officer had made crass remarks and was dismissive of the survivor's complaint. Further, a survivor was again informed by a specially trained, I think it was a background in domestic violence investigation, so they were specially trained to respond to domestic violence victims. And their response to the male survivor was that, again, this is a quote, but they were told, that as a man, I was by nature more guilty of this crime and could not be a victim of it. So imagine the impact of that on the survivor, re-traumatization. Lack of confidence of male rape survivors in the CGS. A lot of legal cynicism around, and just, why bother, what's the point in reporting? So another deterrent to survivors in their treatment is treatment by the courts and possible secondary victimization. Woodin, Orage, Hine, Murphy, and Murgy 2022, in their study, they looked at 9 cases of non-recent sexual victimization. And they found, again, the influence and manifestation, male rape myths, which I've already spoken about, challenges in self-recognition and disclosure, and barriers to accessing therapeutic support and reporting to the criminal justice system. Also, with Raj et al. 2022, supported the rejection of male victims they supported the findings that the rejection of male rape victims from female rape services. So again, when they didn't know where to get help, some were so desperate they were contacting female rape crisis organizations, and you can imagine the impact of the kind of rejection from more essentialist gendered narratives with regard to invisibilizing them and rejecting their legitimacy. So getting that negative response. Obviously, that's not the case with all female rape crisis centres and related agencies, but for some, again, if we're thinking that those were non-recent survivors, it was quite problematic. Hines et al. 2020 stated 1 in 5 males withdrew their allegation of rape. Again, really big problem of attrition. Again, this is something that's flagged up in the reports, 2021 reports, whether it's Operation Soteria Bluestone or the HMICFRS Joint Inspection Reports, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. What they also found is that in the Hines paper, they found that on their analysis of 122 cases of male rape reported to the Metropolitan Police Service, that these survivors were more likely than the female rape cases to have a victim-offender relationship with a stranger and have substance misuse involved and mental health issues, and that they were more likely to be no crime. Well, what's interesting as well with regard to that victim-offender relationship being stranger is that, again, to go back to some research and a quote kind of from Susan Estridge, who talked about a real rape script, was that predominantly people thought, well, they've got a stronger case if it's a stranger. People are going to believe them more for this real rape script, okay? Which is why there might be that more prevalence of stranger rapes rather than acquaintance rapes. Lack of information on services. So there are inconsistencies in police officers' levels of knowledge of support services. Again, if we think often SOLITs weren't necessarily first on the scene, you might have first responders who aren't appropriately trained to respond to these complex cases. Yeah? There could be delays in assigning SOLIT officers because there's a lack of resources. And this is still the case, if not worse, today. So, there were delays, as I said, to referring SOLIT officers to the case, challenges of assigning SOLITs due to lack of resources, and working on several cases simultaneously. Also, when I was conducting the research, sometimes you have that SOLIT officer building up a rapport, halfway through the case, they get reassigned. Think of that trauma again with regard to the survivor. They built up this rapport, things were going well, and then they've got to start from scratch with a new SOLIT officer. Okay. Think against that point with the levels of attrition. Okay. But I hasten to add, because it's all doom and gloom, there was some best practice. Okay. Some positive comments regarding SOLIT officers. Some allowed male survivors to take their time, remained in constant contact, allowed time to come back if they needed more time. Survivors also noted that it was challenging, though, to balance that victim care element and empathy with their investigative duties, and sometimes there might be like a more hollow form of empathy. But the other issue for officers, and again this is something that comes up later on, is those that were praised, those SOLIT officers, they were the ones who were then constantly called upon because they said, oh, you know, so-and-so, they're really good at this. So then you have the problem of emotional labor and those really good SOLIT officers getting burnt out. So, recommendations, which were fed to the College of Policing to use to inform training, but were there needed to be more awareness around male rape myths. Okay? There needed to be this deconstruction with regard to tackling that in police responses, as well as gender stereotypes. They're not helpful to anybody. Yeah? Not all women are the same, not all men are the same, not all survivors are the same. There's a diversity across male rape survivors. So you can't be making kind of blanket decisions. So, again, with regard to gender stereotypes, the choice of SOAD officer, don't just assume they want a particular gender of SOAD officer. Ask them. And misconceptions about how quickly victims or survivors are expected to report to the police. We know about long disclosure times. Yeah, it can be 20 plus years. So you don't go to the survivor, why is it taking you so long to report? Understanding the impact of masculinity and psychological trauma. And also trying to move away from this whole focus on victim credibility and spend the same amount of time looking at the victim as they are looking at the suspect. We need to balance that out more because it's historically been weighted in relation to the survivor. So taking it, and I've mentioned about the diversity, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So what then happened? So, right up to 2017, okay, there's a change. Disbanding of Project Sapphire and the Central Sapphire Unit. Why? Well, this was kind of in response to the 2015 Angelini report, okay, which was saying that there are major issues in the policing response to rape. So, they decentralized the provision and made it more localized. Aimed to identify patterns across local communities and also have kind of closer integration with victim support services. Okay? All sounds good on paper. Also, just for your information there, I was just an update with regard to the SOAD's STOs. But the SOAD officer, as I said, is a specially trained officer, not necessarily a detective. The main focus is on the welfare of the victim and supporting them through an investigation, conducting specialist interviews, often acting as the main point of contact. But the main, obviously, they report then to the IO, the investigating officer. You then have, so the way Sapphire officers now sit is that there are Sapphire units in every borough. So the borough command units, and they come under the public protection strand. They get about 3 to 4 weeks of training. I'll leave it up to you whether you think that's sufficient. Also, you've got, there's so many different types of investigators, special investigators, which are RASOs. They are detectives, make arrests and prepare the case for the prosecutors. You also have specialist rape and sexual assault investigators. They handle like the day-to-day sexual offence investigations, conduct initial victim support and evidence gathering, work with local safeguarding partners, and are more experienced and they'll deal with complex kind of cases. So, I did say I'd mentioned Operation Soteria, Bluestone. So, Project Bluestone, I don't know whether you're familiar with that. That was a pilot project with the Avon and Somerset Police, okay? Looking into rape investigation, and they found that there needed to be a focus on procedural justice in relation to how survivors are dealt with and responded to. Respect was key. Giving victims and survivors a voice. Neutrality. Being trustworthy. This all needed to be applied to police victim engagement. Also, in this Operation Soteria Bluestone, because that then superseded the whole Project Bluestone, They also found that there's continuing to be a lack of confidence in the police and CPS, supporting my previous findings. This legal cynicism still ongoing, lack of trust, attrition still pretty bad, if not worse. But what was also flagged up here and in the evolved strategy, which I'm going to talk about briefly, is the overlap between sexual violence and domestic abuse. But again, I don't know about parallels in relation to male rape survivors and female rape survivors in that regard. But there seems to be more of a focus there, that there needs to be more joined up working in relation to sexual violence and domestic abuse. But what was introduced is the 6-pillar national operating model. So for this, and this is what you'll see if you read any of these reports, is again, as I said, suspect-focused investigations, disrupting repeat offenders, because obviously they're responsible for the majority of offences, procedural justice victim engagement, but also focus on officer learning and well-being. Data use, again, there needs to be, and digital content. There's been more recent change in legislation with the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, because again, something that the officers tended to do once the case was reported is to do a digital dump of all that kind of data from the phones, which again caused concern for survivors about privacy rights, etc. So under this Crime and Sentencing Act, there needs to be more managed, select collation of this data and analysed, much better than it has been historically. Also, all of this needs to be research-led. There needs to be much better, under this Soteria Bluestone, much more working closely together with academics and evidence-led training, looking at these areas. With the 2021 Joint Inspection Report of the HMIC FRS, what they found was that there needs to be better decision-making, fewer delays, improved communication with victims in the CPS, but there needs to be enough trained specialist capability with the support and capacity to do the work. There needs to be better and more joined up working between the police and CPS, because again, remember, towards the beginning of this, I was talking about how police put in all their efforts, and you get it to the CPS, and then they'll be like, no, we're not continuing with this, right? So, it was suggested that the police need to seek early evidence advice from the CPS, so that if they get told, this is what you need to do to get it to the trial stage. Okay, sounds simple. But with the CPS, there's a lot of delays. So they're asking for the advice, but they're not getting in a timely manner. So all these recommendations sound great in principle, but the practicalities can be a bit more challenging. Then we've got the 2023 rape review. So again, this is like, okay, well, what's been happening? Adult rape charges increasing by 65%, rising further in 2023, but convictions remain low. Okay. Then we have VOG, violence against women and girls, and the men and boys explanatory note. I could go on with this, but let's just say it's not very inclusive. And the explanatory note's only about a substantive, like 18 pages. So you can draw your own conclusions as to what message that is sending to survivors. And again, it was suggested, the findings of this explanatory note, this is a quote, the initial response, particularly by police, is critical. Poor handling at this stage, including disbelief, minimization, or lack of empathy, can lead to victims withdrawing from engagement, hence rape attrition. Male victims have reported feeling dismissed or not taken seriously, especially when the perpetrator is female, due to entrenched gender stereotypes. Any of this sounding familiar at all? 2026, so what do we do? Where to now? Well, that's what I say to my students about we can all do our little bit, about raising awareness at a more societal level with regard to schools and universities, supporting research to address gaps as well with regard to, and this was mentioned earlier on, around military sexual trauma, and a lot being done there, disabled male victims, neurodiverse male victim survivors. Again, we need to engage ethnic minority male rape survivors, because again, traditionally, literature has been quite white. Older male victims and survivors as well. Again, they tend to be an invisible population. And we need more evidence-led and specialised training for the police and CPS. Right, so here's some more male sexual harm publications, projects and advocacy. There's some of the studies that I've already mentioned, but I want to talk about One Taxi Ride. This is a documentary film that I was research consultant on. Filmed and set in Mexico. Eric was a male rape survivor, and this film is about his disclosure to his family and the impact of that, not only on his family, but also on his relationships as well. So it charts this whole journey for him. Basically, at the age of 17, on his birthday night out, he was gang raped, having taken a taxi to go home, hence the title One Taxi Ride. The whole purpose of this film is to raise awareness of male rape on the global stage. It went to all these independent film festivals, and what's interesting is that the premiere in Mexico, where Eric and his family sat on the stage for a Q&A. So once the film was shown, then the audience could engage with them directly. Is that the amount of disclosures from the LGBTQIA+ community was quite a few. So much so that at later screenings, we had to have specialist counselling there for people who felt, because it had created a safe space for people to finally disclose. Also associated with this film is a petition. I'd encourage you all to, I don't know whether you can take a picture of that and try the link. I meant to put a QR code, but I forgot. To lobby the Mexican government to take male rape more seriously. So that's still ongoing. We've only got about 4,000 signatures, so every little bit helps. So that's that project. And just some of my more recent publications. I've written the first book on transphobic hate crime, and you might be wondering why I'm mentioning that here. But off the back of it, I got invited to participate in the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime conference workshop on hate crime. And then had to report back from that workshop to the UN members more generally on the global stage about what we discussed, and I took that opportunity not only to talk about transphobic hate crime, but to mention my previous research and background in male rape research, because a lot of those countries don't even consider male rape a crime. So I thought I'm never going to get this opportunity again, so I thought I'd just mention it. And also I've been looking into the specialist policing of transphobic hate crime by LGBT+ specialist officers. So there's some more recent conference presentations